So whether you're just starting out or you're advanced, it is extremely beneficial to watch other people and to learn how they do things, because maybe you're going to learn something new that you can apply to your own work. So without further ado, let's just get straight into it. Okay, so this is our first photo we have here. And for this one, it's just a simple photo. You know, the sky's pretty well exposed. It's a bit underexposed in this little corner around here. But as we get into it, we're just going to try and see what we can do with it to make it pop and really become a great photo, which it was. Okay, so what we're going to do to start off with is I'm going to get this white balance just about white. So I've clicked on my little tool here, and I'm going to pick a neutral target, which I'm going to make our cupboards where the light is shining. And that's really bumped it down a little bit, which I think is a tiny bit too much, so I'm going to bring it back up to where I think is really good, which I think is about there. Okay, so I think the exposure is pretty good, as we can see in our histogram. Maybe it's a bit low, could probably bump up a tiny bit, and that's pretty good. Okay, so I'll bring the highlights down a little bit, and we're just going to bump up our whites. And the shadows can come up a lot, and we'll bump back our blacks to add that tiny bit more clarity and contrast to the image. Okay, after this, what I like to do is try and see if there is any noise in the image before I get into anything else. So basically, if I zoom right in to the sky, I can see that there is some noise in the sky up around here, this area, and on the mountain itself. So what I'll do is I'll close this basic panel. Don't worry about all this. Go down to the detail panel where it says sharpening and noise reduction. So what I do is I just keep bumping this up slowly till it gets to about above 50, and that's where we'll see a big difference. Okay, so we're at about 55 now, and if we take it too far, you can see that it unsharpens the image, which we don't want. We want it to still stay sharp, but get rid of that noise. So I think around about 50 is pretty good. So the color noise seems to be okay, there's not too much, and we'll just bump that sharpness up a little bit because I want the image to be sharp and really to pop, which is good. Okay, we'll go back to the basic panel now. Everything else is looking not too bad. We might just bump up that clarity a tiny bit. You don't want to take it too far because then it'll make everything look really fake. So if I take it all the way to 100 at the moment, you can see how fake it looks. It just looks not even real. So we'll just bump it down to around about 23. So when you're using the clarity tool, there's a fine line between taking it too far and not far enough, and you really got to find that point, and it's something that each individual is going to be a tiny bit different to what your style sort of is. So I think that's a tiny bit too far there, maybe about there. Now just add a tiny bit of contrast as well to separate the whites from the blacks. I think that's a bit too much. So I think still the shadows are a tiny bit too dark, so I'm just going to bump them up a little bit as well. That looks pretty good. Maybe the highlights back a little bit more, and that looks pretty good there. Okay, I'm going to add some vibrance and a tiny bit of saturation. But if I look at this image right now, you could say, wow, you've made a big difference. Look at that difference. Massive. You can see the difference there. It's a massive difference. But we still want to take it that one step further. So here's what we'll do. Okay, we'll close this and we'll go down to HSL. We're not going to worry about the tone curve in this image because we changed the contrast and the clarity in the basic panel, which is basically what the tone curve is going to do roughly for us. Okay, so what I'm going to see in this image is the green's too green and the blue's too blue. Maybe the oranges could come down a little bit because in his skin I think it's a tiny bit too orange and it just looks fake. So what we'll do is we'll lower the sky to start with, maybe to about there. We'll get rid of the greens and we'll lower the yellows a little bit. Okay, I still think those oranges in her skin could come down. Whoop, that's a tiny bit too much. Maybe to about there. So in the sky, I really like an aqua sky because when I look out, that's what I see. So I'll just lower these blues a little bit till we find that perfect touch. And you see if you go too far, that's when it sort of becomes way too fake. So there's a fine line with the hue as well. So we might put it around 8 and maybe bump up that saturation of the blue again. Go back to the hue. So you can see that orange that I was saying. If you bump up the orange and try and make it a more skin color tone, on this it won't do it in the hue. So we'll go to saturation, we'll leave that there, and luminance, we want to really isolate our subject. So you want the eye of the viewer to be focused on us, not so much on the background. So we'll just bring up the oranges so they sort of become a lot more luminant, tiny bit, which is about there. We'll lower the greens and lower the blues. So we'll lower the blues that tiny bit. Now one thing I like to do with my images as well is go down to the lens correction and enable that. As you can see, when you enable that, on my lens, it seems to be darker around the outside, and that is the Tamron which I use. So if I untick it, you can see it loses a lot of colour on the outside and exposure, and it also looks like a bit of vignetting, which I hate. So we'll put that back on, and look at that. Beautiful. That's our final image, I think. That looks pretty good. Maybe the vibrance could just come down a tiny bit. So that is before and after. So as you can see, it was a lot flatter here where the colours are, and we're sort of bringing that out. Her skin's a lot more vibrant, the ground looks better. Okay, so we'll move on to the next image now, which I think we'll start with this one. So we've got an overexposed sort of sky here. The horse is running, it's a tiny bit blurry, but it looks pretty cool all in all. Now as I look at this photo, I can notice that it is crooked a little bit. So I'm just going to straighten it up, and I'm going to use the crop tool here, and I can tell you right now that fence is what I'm going to go for. So I'm going to make that fence my little margin. Done. And that looks a lot better. But there is another way. You could line it up with the horizon there, which it looks pretty good. Okay, so we'll go with that. And we might even crop this into like a 1:1 sort of image. Maybe something like that. So the other horses in the image as well. We'll just start with this one now. I'm going to start on the white balance again. So I know it's a cloudy day, and I'm just going to automatically hit that. But that's not yellowy enough. So we'll bring that up a little bit. Perfect. Just get this histogram back for us. So we know the exposure needs to be brought up a little bit with the whites. Highlights can sort of come down. Whites can come up. Shadows. The shadows don't need to be brought up too much because it's a pretty good and sharp image. We'll just bring those blacks down a little bit. Now we'll add a bit of vibrance, add a bit of saturation, and this time we'll use the tone curve instead of using the contrast, and we'll see how we go. So we'll bring that one up there, and what we sort of want to do is make an S on all the colors. So we'll go to red, and it may look a bit funny to start with, but once you go through all the colors and do it, you'll realize that you really have to do it with all of them to get the color that you want. Bring that up there, but it's just a tiny bit too contrasty. So we'll just go back to the RGB, bring that up a little bit, and bring this one closer to normal. Okay, that looks pretty good. But what we'll do is, again, the grass is just way too green and looks fake. So what we'll do is we'll get rid of that greens. This yellows could probably come down a little bit as well. So as you can see, our whites are really overexposed here. So what we might try and do is bring down the whites a little bit, try and move it across, and maybe we'll bring up our exposure as well. A tiny bit, because we can see on a histogram what's going on really. So our luminance, we might bring up the orange, bring up the yellow, bring up the yellow a little bit. So it's a tiny bit blurry as you can see, but I think that adds to the motion that the horse is actually running. And you can really tell with that bit of blur in there, which I don't mind. It actually looks pretty good. Everything else seems to look okay. We might just bring down those greens a tiny bit more because I really don't like those greens in saturation. Maybe even the yellows a little bit. It sort of gives the appeal that it's like a rustic photo. Like it's not something that's taken on a new camera, which is really cool. And we might just add a tiny bit of clarity, too much. And maybe some texture. So that's the before, that's the after. As we can see, as we move across, really a massive difference in that photo. Okay, now we'll get into our final image, which is going to be Ash on the mountain, which we'll just reset this image, get it back to what it was, so I can show you exactly how I'm going to do this photo. So this is one of our biggest photos that we had on Instagram that really took off, so we'll show you what we're going to do so you can create the same if similar. So if I look at this photo, it's a tiny bit underexposed, white balance is a tiny bit off, So we'll bring down the highlights, bring up the whites. Shadows can come up because I really want to bring out the leaves and the detail. Blacks can go down. Now there is a bit of noise in this image, I'm pretty sure. So if we zoom in, you can tell on the trees in the background there is a lot of noise. So we'll immediately go down to the detail and change that. So we'll add in that noise reduction, which probably is about there. And if there is any color noise, which I cannot see, doesn't seem to be, which is good. So we can leave that there. We'll just sharpen that up a tiny bit to make sure none of those features get lost as I brought up the noise reduction. So we'll go back to the basic curve, add some contrast, a bit of vibrance, and a bit of saturation. We'll also add in a bit of clarity, tiny bit. Perfect. So now we'll go down to the HSL tab on the saturation, and the green in the trees is way too green. As everybody knows, I hate green. So I'll bring those greens down and the yellows down as well. But we'll raise those oranges because that's going to be the texture of her skin. But one thing I can really notice in this image is the back, that back mountain there has really become like a blue instead of a white for the snow. So we'll just back off that blue saturation a tiny bit. And we can now see that it's sort of becoming a bit more of a whitey colour. And I'll just drag this down tiny bit to see what it does. And that looks pretty good there, I think, for that back mountain. Even maybe a tiny bit more on the saturation side. If we drag that luminance up, that looks great. So we drag the luminance up. You could drag it down if you didn't want it, but now when we drag that up, it really gave it that sense of the sun setting over here somewhere in the corner of the photo. And it's shining straight on her face, and it looks really great. So again, we'll drag the green down to the trees, the yellows down a little bit. Now if you can see as well, on her fingers, they almost look a bit red. So we'll try go back into the saturation and lower that, because a lot of her skin actually looks a bit red, and it's probably from the cold in the sky, in the air, sorry. So we'll drag down those reds a little bit, not too much, and that looks a lot better. Just go to that lens correction again, make sure that's enabled. There's probably a tiny bit too much exposure, maybe not. I'll probably leave it around about there, but we can see our highlights are a bit low, so we're just going to bring them up a tiny bit, and we'll bring the whites as well to follow. And we'll just lower those highlights. Okay, and I think that looks pretty good, to be honest. And the crop tool, I'm pretty sure that's the original photo. Yes, it is. And that looks pretty good. That's the original, that's what we're left with. I think that's a great photo. I might just add a bit more contrast to the image, which really separates those light and dark areas in the photo. And you could even go into the tone curve if you really wanted to get those shadows down, bring that exposure up, but I don't think that works too well in this photo, especially since I've played with the clarity and the contrast already. So we'll just bring that clarity up maybe a tiny bit more. I think that's a bit too much personally. But as you can see from the example, a quick 10 minutes and that's what we left with. And that's a massive difference in that photo as well, which is really great. Okay guys, so I really hope you enjoyed this tutorial and watch me edit. Maybe you can learn something from it to bring to your own images, or you could drop a comment below and tell me about your editing process, or maybe link me to your own videos so I can learn more as well. We will be releasing presets soon for your own Instagram that you don't need Lightroom for. You can just apply them to your Instagram and then lower the opacity as you like and as you need on your own photos. So thank you for watching. Please subscribe, stick around, because we'll be releasing more videos very shortly. Thanks guys.